Now we're going to go over some of the effects of heat expansion and heat damage from the X factor event. What we see here is a building where the outside of it is being melted downward and forming a rock curtain covering it up. And as you can see here, you can see the red brick and concrete are being churned into and crystallized. As it becomes viscous and fluid, the heat is able to expand and thin it out so fast that when it hardened back up again, it crystallized. It's like you can almost, I don't know what the heck that is. It's looking like brick lines, but perhaps this was filling an empty space really fast as it thinned out the liquid building so fast, and when it hardened again, it crystallized. Here's like an effect of it being churned into crystal here. It is important to study the behavior of heat and the heat effect and heat expansion. It's very important to study the behavior of heat, and more specifically, the behavior of heat expansion. Here you have these concrete columns with the pin stripes absolutely crystallized and cracked up and cut up and cracked from being so cooked. These are columns, not tree stumps or trees. It's all these red brick that is crystallized, and here is a red brick that has been crystallized. Here we find gold all over these melted buildings. Perhaps it's part of the process of the quartz crystals and brick and concrete, heat and pressure. What we see melting here, viscousness, holes of it separating, coming apart, being hot, and then hardening again. Here we can imagine during the X factor event this was hot, flowing like lava, and when it densified, there's nothing left. It was so cooked into this fine grained sand, but before that the heat was trying to expand outward and upward as it became, the solids became viscous and hot, and then it was frozen in time, crystallized. Here you can see some red brick concrete to the left, and then the rest of it just melted into this blue dripping color. Here again, what we see is a solid, and as soon as the solid gives way and becomes viscous enough, the heat expands out into different geometrical shapes. Squares, circles, and columns is what I have seen. But as soon as this solid here becomes viscous enough, it expands out from the heat, and then everything hardened again for us to see it. In other words, there was a quick cool off. Something cooled everything off very fast and hardened everything in mid-air, the melting. Here you can see the heat expanding as it becomes viscous and more liquid and fluid. The heat can expand out and upward into these columns. Here it's more of a column that's kind of square. Here it's midstream, going crystal here. But it's all heat expansion. It's all from heat of the X factor event. And again, frozen in time. Here's what it looks like. These little columns expanding out in all directions. See these little crystal columns? That's heat expansion frozen in time. And then you have other things giving way to heat and pressure. That looks like gold, ruby, gems, crystals, quartz, etc. Many different things. Silver, all kinds of different things created out of this X factor event. But the behavior of heat, it seems to expand out in these columns like this. Kind of like Superman's cave, but that's all melted buildings, crystallized. The interiors seem to crystallize more. The heat has somewhere to expand into, and that's an empty cavern inside a building. A room in a building is where you're going to see these things expand and form crystals. So any empty rooms in any of these buildings, you're going to see, like the hole I showed before, when it's going to form crystals because the heat is expanding and escaping outward. And again, all this was hot, and it's been turned into these, churned up into these, what looks like little crystals and opals. Here's a perfect example of the behavior of heat being frozen in time. Heat expanding out in all directions, forming these columns. And then it's frozen in time, but you can see the behavior of heat forming these crystals out of the buildings. And again, you have an empty space in here where the heat is hot, the red brick melted concrete. Now it's an empty space. It gets thin viscous. It has somewhere to go, and it forms crystals. And then something hardened it again, solidified, densified it to catch it in time so we could see it. Here at the top is red brick concrete melted, and then here it's been melted into that. Here the red brick, outside you can see what's left of it, of the rock, and in the inside the red color of the carbon-14 squeezed into that mess. Here what's awesome is you can clearly tell that this was like it reminds you of water, reflections of water. It reminds you of sonoluminescence. But what you're seeing here is this was hot liquid melted building. And you could see that it was fluid. You could clearly see this. And then again, it's frozen in time, hardened real fast, densified for us to see it. And you can see that that was flowing hot. And again, the behavior of heat. When it gets viscous, it expands out all directions, forming these crystal columns. That's why you wonder where these columns, these horizontal columns, come from. Here it's just expanding. Heat expansion, heat behavior. Frozen in time. Light, hot, liquid, melted building. Flowing in hot liquid lava melted building. Churning and getting smoothed out from the heat all around it as it forms different shapes as it flows through the current and gets held up by other pieces. In the flow, it creates many different shapes and forms. Here, we see the behavior of heat. Forming a column. Heat expanding outward in these columns. As soon as the solid starts to become viscous enough, gives way to the heat expansion, boom. Crystals are formed. Same with this, different shapes. See all the different crystals here? These little ones, and then boom. Here, what's all that's left of the red brick here? Opal churned in hot liquid building. Here, as you can see where it came from, the crystal, the heat is expanding out, forming these columns. That's how the heat expansion behavior operates and works. As soon as this solid here became viscous enough in this band of heat, boom, it formed a crystal. And again, that's all that's left of the red brick churning in the hot liquid melted building, frozen in time. All that frozen in time. Inside here, crystals, because any open space makes way for heat expansion to form crystals. Brick lines cooked into, wavy, viscous lines. Heat expanding outward. As soon as the red brick becomes viscous enough, the heat will expand out into these columns. That's the behavior of heat and heat expansion. This is all that's left of the red brick. Little pieces of it. You can see the rock, red brick, all churned up in hot liquid melted building. This is all that's left of the red brick here and here. Pieces of the rock, red brick. The heat expands out and crystallizes to different shapes. The purple is the red being cooked into purple, and then when you see the white, that's more of the red carbon cooked out. It was hotter here. and still has more carbon here. Less heat here, more pressure. Less heat, more pressure. Again, as you can see, the heat is absolutely popping out and expanding. Popcorn blocking out, bricking, whatever, popcorn blocking out of this. This is heat expansion. As soon as it becomes, you see little tiny ones expanding from the heat, trying to get out, escape, separating. But you see clear areas here where the heat gets hot enough and it becomes viscous and it expands and starts to push out, pushing out, heat expanding. The behavior of heat forming crystals from the X factor event. Here the red brick being liquefied and then solidified. Here at the bottom you see the red brick, and then the heat, it becomes viscous enough and expands out into columns and squares. We got a blue color there. Look what happened to the brick here. Separating. Here you can see little pieces of what's left of the red brick, but notice the columns, how the heat expands outward in all directions, forming these columns, expanding out from the brick. Crystals forming columns. This is the behavior of heat. This is how, more specifically, heat expansion. Look what happened to the red brick, melted. There's the carbon. Red there. Again, frozen in time, hardened, densified, liquid lava melted building. You can see that it was flowing, fluid, viscous. Here you can see as soon as this red brick concrete becomes viscous enough, boom, it expands outward. The heat, it balloon rocks it. It's very similar to the behavior of balloon rocking. It's the same idea, principle. It becomes viscous enough, the heat pushes it out to form crystals. Here you can see the behavior of heat, frozen in time, red brick crystallized. And then the red brick here, crystallized. You can even see the super hot bright light of the heat. Here you can still see the red brick here, crystallized. Here it looks more pressure than heat. Why? Because there's a lot of dark carbon left in this crystal as it expanded. It's more pressure than heat, because if it was heat, it would be, the color would be more cooked out. So this is incredible to see, this type of crystallization where it seems to be trying to escape from pressure and heat, but a lot less heat, if you will. Here a lot more heat, more of a glass look, if you will, carbon thoroughly cooked out. Here the red brick, vitrified, crystallized from the X factor event. And again, here you can see more carbon as the heat tried to expand out. So you still have carbon and color in the purple, red to purple. Here it expanded further, but no carbon left. The color has been cooked out, and it's expanding out even further, forming new crystals, even cooked further than the purple crystals with more carbon in it. Here it's all crystallized red brick. This is rock, not flesh, from other beings. Flesh biodegrades immediately and rots. Everything biodegradable does not turn into rock. It's ridiculous. Again, here you can see heat expanding, the heat behavior frozen in time as the color gets cooked out and expands from the brick and gives way from the viscousness and viscosity. Boom, it gives way and the heat expands outward, forming crystals, and in this case, circles. You get more of this, but sometimes you get squares and circles, and sometimes you get a being from the old world, a victim of the X factor event, skull that got crystallized. Here, this is fantastic evidence frozen in time, the behavior of heat. Notice what's left of red brick and concrete and how the heat is expanding in columns outward in all directions. A lot of columns, you know, and it looks kind of like gold, quartz, crystal. Look at all this heat behavior frozen in time for us to study and examine. And again here, you'll have the mainstream narrative completely destroyed by my research of the truth. What you see here is this is nothing more than melted red brick and concrete, forming rock and melting. And then you get your opals, crystallization, different layers. That's only become, somebody has sharpened it and used it as an arrowhead perhaps, but it's all melted rock and concrete. And you have the different layers of opals and crystallization. It's not a megalodon. This is ridiculous nonsense. Again, our truth is destroying the mainstream nonsense narrative. It's destroying it. Again, not flesh. Flesh is biodegradable. No such thing. It's ridiculous. This is all red brick crystallized. Red brick crystallized, not flesh. Flesh biodegrades.